Professor M. Fiscal is the present chairman of the National Institute of Finance and Policy and chairman, Agriculture Credit Review of the Reserve Bank of India. He is a well-known economist. He was professor of economics in Delhi University for 17 years, then Vice Chancellor at Aligarh Muslim University. Earlier he was ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany and also member of the Planning Commission Republic of India.
In the previous session, we dealt with the control of national expenditure and how price level could be contained by keeping the national expenditure in line with national output. Now, maintenance of the price level and the containment of it is not the only objective of a developing economy. In fact, the major objective is to bring about an increase in supplies, an increase in output. And the question is, how is that to be done? That leads us to the present discussion that we might have on how to augment supplies in a semi-planned or a planned economy. That's what India has been for some years now. Now, there are many planning models and quite a few sophistications have been introduced. India also has introduced in its practice and planning and policy concerns various ideas about how to plan for the development of the economy. It turns out that the planning of infrastructures is a crucial part of the planned development of output. Now, here I think one must know what it is that one does first and what one does next, and what is the sequence in which the various phases of planning are conceived and implemented. I would like to show with the help of this chart here that as we said, national expenditures and national output have to be kept in line if prices are to be contained, but the basic objective is to push national output itself upwards and as fast as possible. So we have not only that objective, but also the better distribution of that output, accompanied by some other objectives like improved self-reliance and increased employment and increased investment. Now, how does one begin? Roughly, and by the way, this is a simplification of the reality, and all the sophistications that we have undertaken in this country cannot be shown just now at one go, but suffice it to say that a basic model, which is the starting point, is the Harrod-Domar model, which says simply, and that's a simplification of genius, that the rate of growth of the economy change in income in relation to the base income. That is to say, shall we say 5%. 5 units is the change in income and 100 units was the base income. The rate of growth was 5%. If that is to be 5%, that can be brought about provided the marginal rate of saving, change in saving in relation to change in income, is in line with certain values of the marginal output capital ratio. This is the change in output resulting from a change in capital, which is the same thing as investment. Delta K is the same thing as investment. Now, the theory says that the rate of growth of income of an economy will depend upon, that's real income by the way, will depend upon the marginal rate of saving in conjunction with the output capital ratio. Or in numerical terms, a 5% growth of the economy, for instance, will be the result of a 20% rate of saving of the margin and a 1/4 output capital ratio. Now, this rate of saving, economists believe, is a master summing of the behavior pattern of society. It won't happen just like that the society gets to a 20% or 25% rate of saving out of its income. Many behavioral factors might bring that about and might bring it about in due course. For instance, the question will be whether people are typically savers or spenders, whether Calvin or a Martin Luther and a Gandhi has been born or not, in order to preach restrained consumption and increased saving, whether saving institutions are efficient, and whether the policies of the government are conducive to increased saving. All that together will bring about the behavior complex which may lead to a certain rate of saving, a high marginal rate of saving. At the same time, the capital output ratio, here the inverse of it, output capital ratio, say 1:4 output capital ratio or 4:1 output capital ratio, will not come about on its own. The capital output ratio is another master summing up of the technological milieu of a society, whether the capital stock is efficient or not, whether it's informed of the best technologies or not, whether its utilization rate is good, whether labor is participating with capital effectively, or are they too many lost labor days. All these considerations will lead to a certain value of the capital output ratio. Now, if the rate of saving of the margin was 20% and the output capital ratio is 1:4 in a certain society, then this 4 will go 5 times there and the rate of growth will be 5%. Should saving increase to 24%, for instance, while the output capital ratio remains the same, then the rate of growth will increase to 6%. Should saving come down to 16%, the same output capital ratio, then the growth rate will be 4%. Should the capital output ratio worsen to a 4:1 figure, that is the capital output ratio of 1:6, in that case, the growth rate of an economy would slow down. So, the thing to remember is that the growth rate of an economy is a resultant of how well and how much people are saving in an economy and how efficiently the capital stock of the economy is being utilized in terms of generation of output. Now we have to decide what should be the growth rate of the economy. Partly that depends upon what we have achieved by way of savings ratio and the output capital ratio, and partly it depends upon political factors or political economic factors. If you impose a rate of saving of 30% in an economy, that will require too much diversion of consumption into saving, and that might involve hardship on the society, especially in a poor society. At the same time, utilization of, at the same time, if we had a 3% growth rate down, nobody would even notice it, because much of it would be lost in the growth of population. Therefore, there is a lower political limit, shall we say, to the growth rate, shall we say 3%, 4%, 5%, and there is an upper political limit, that is to say 7% and 8%, beyond which the society will feel that it is being harassed too much by way of having to pay too many taxes or having to forego a lot of consumption. Bearing these political-economic factors in mind, one determines the rate of growth, and in India we found that over the years, a targeting of 5% growth rate roughly would be in order, because Indian saving rate was rising towards 20 and 22 and 23, 24%, and output capital ratio was reasonably. Only in recent time this has worsened to something like 1:5 or 1:6, and that has tended to slow down the growth rate. On the other hand, an enhancement of the rate of saving has tended to increase that growth rate. So, at this point, to sum up, one notes that the capital output ratio and the savings ratio of the economy will determine the growth rate of the economy, and the growth rate has to be fixed within the political limits on the one side and within the technologically feasible limits on the other. Having decided this, and having decided, let us say, a 5% growth rate of the economy, or some small change from that, 5.1, 4.9, whatever seems sensible on balance, given the numbers, one uses this growth rate in going to the next step in planning, of making demand projections for various commodities. Only 3 commodities demand projections have been mentioned here, but there may be 80 commodities, or as in India now, something like 180 commodities would be used for demand estimation, and using the best techniques available to us for demand projections, one would ask what 5 years later at the end of the plan period would be the demand for commodity 1, commodity 2 and commodity 3. That would be determined, and similarly the demand for all other 118 or so commodities might be determined. Having gone over this step of demand projection, one goes to the next steps in planning, and I repeat that this is almost an oversimplified model of planning, but I think it is close to reality in the sense that these are in fact the steps undertaken, but undertaken in a more sophisticated way. Having got the demand for commodity 1, 2 and 3, D1, D2, D3 and Dn, 118 or so, one notes that this is the final demand for different commodities which society might be demanding at that growth rate of income. But then the question will be, don't we need other inputs to produce these commodities? Surely we need to demand other commodities to produce these ones, and these are intermediates mostly, and they come out of the famous input-output table. There are methods of manipulation of this table, which were originally due to Professor the Nobel Prize winner, and in this table you have rows and columns, and in each column and row you find numbers which show how much the output of this commodity, say leather, would be used by the next industry, iron and steel, next industry, food grain, next industry, something else, next industry, something else. And looking vertically at these columns, one knows how much industry C, let us say, A, B and C, how much industry C would be demanding of goods of industry A, of industry B, and of industry C itself, and so on. It's a much larger table than this one. And from this, one gets to know the demand, the derived demand for various inputs in the commodity. So now we have final demand, we have derived demand, and having got all that, the next question in planning is, shall we produce all that is demanded in this country, or shall we import something from other countries? Surely we have to import something in any case, and something which is much better produced and much more cheaply produced in other countries, and that leads to large exercises as to who produces what best and what we should import from whom. Well, we take the demand for the commodity 1, and we subtract out of that what we shall not produce but import, M1, but we add to that what we shall export of this commodity. So then we produce target and output, which is nothing but our own demand less imports plus exports. That gives us the targeted output of commodity 1, and that way we go on to targeted output, or better still additional targeted output, additional output of O1, O2, O3, O4 and so on to ON. Targeted outputs. We deduce this from our own estimation of demand and our own ideas of what to import and what to export. Having got the output targets, this is not the Indian 5-year plan. Indian 5-year plan is not output targets, actually it is investment targets. Now we remember that investment is nothing but change in the capital stock. If capital stock was 100 to begin with and 5 years later it was 110, then 10 additional units of investment might have done the trick of raising the capital stock. So delta K, change in capital stock, is the same thing as investment, and in this diagram very often for the sake of brevity and to make the diagram more simple, we are omitting the deltas, but all the time we have deltas, additional output, additional capital, additional labor, they will not always write the delta. Having got the targeted output, we then ask the question, how much additional capital is required in Industry 1 to produce that additional output of Industry 1, how much capital stock in Industry 2, delta K2, and how much additional capital stock in Industry N and all the intermediate industries. What should be the investment? We get that result in a very important way, and very simplified way, by just multiplying the targeted output with the known capital output ratio of that industry, the known marginal capital output ratio of that industry. By simple multiplication, these two cancel out, and you get the targeted investment or additional capital required, actually delta K1 required, by this simple multiplication. Similarly, we take the output targeted for Industry 2, 3, 4, and N and multiply each one of these by the targeted capital output ratios of those industries, and we get the targeted investment, the investment that is required to produce that much output to meet that much demand. So you see the logic is quite terse here, and having got these delta Ks, or what is the same thing, investments in different industries, that is approximately India's 5-year plan. Our plans essentially are investment plans. But planning does not end there. After having gotten additional capital stock required to produce what we want to produce, we go on to ask how much demand for labor would come about as a result of these investments in different industries. That's a complex matter. That's why Indian planning has not fully come to estimate the demand for labor very neatly. And you will see why it is so difficult to do that. We take the targeted additional capital stock required of each industry, and what we do is delta K1, but labor of type 1 and labor of type 2 will be required in one industry. So taking different types of labor, A, B, C, separately, we multiply the capital stock required in Industry 1 of labor of type A with the labor capital ratio, how much labor goes with 1 unit of capital in that industry of that type of labor. K1A and K1A cancel out, and you get L1A, that is labor required in Industry 1 of variety A. Similarly, labor required in Industry 1 of variety B is obtained by just multiplying the required additional capital stock of that industry with the labor capital ratio for that type of labor of that industry, and that gives us the additional labor force required of Industry 1. Similarly, of Industry 2 here, and Industry 3 and 4 and Industry N, the labor requirements can be determined, but in a very complex manner. Mind you, there is another complexity. Each industry output may be produced by more than one technique. Several techniques might be coexisting in an industry, as well as several types of labor, and for each technique, which means the relation between labor and capital in that technique, for each technique and each type of labor we have got to do that, and that's what makes life a little complex. That's why Indian planning has not yet come to do that fully. Even if planning does not do it, the market is doing it. Market does require labor to go with that much additional capital in each line of industry, in each type of labor, and each technique. So market is doing that, and one must be aware what is coming out of the market. Well, if you take labor of each variety, and we know the wage rate of that variety, then a multiplication of the quantum of labor of each type with the wage rate prevailing in the market will give you the wage bill of that type of labor, and summing up all wage bills of this sort, you will get the total wage income of the society. And similarly, taking the income of capitalists, the owners of capital stock, and summing them up, you will get the capital income. So labor, capital income, both would come out, and in approximate way, and that would approximate to the total income of society and its distribution, depending upon what way the wage rates and whose wage rate it was, and how many people were in each category of wage earners. So that will give an income distribution. Now, just to quickly go over the thing for memory's sake, you first estimate the growth rate of the economy as best as you can. Using that growth rate, you estimate the demand for different commodities, final demand. Then you estimate the derived demand for different commodities, and then you subtract imported quantums and add exported quantums, and you get the output targets for different industries, and then using the marginal capital output ratio of each industry, applying it to the output target, you get the additional capital required, that is investment in each industry, which is the 5-year plan. And then, if you wish, by suitable multiplications of these investments with the labor capital ratios, you get the demand for labor, and then using the wage rates prevailing, you could estimate crudely some income distribution. Now, the crucial point here is the income distribution that has emerged as a result of following all these steps. The income distribution that has emerged need not tally with, need not be in line with the targeted outputs or the targeted demand. There is no good reason why the income distribution emerging should exactly exhaust through purchases all the output that you originally decided would be demanded. Therefore, troubles arise. Excesses of production in relation to demand in some cases, shortages of production in relation to demand in some other cases, and this is the usual story of excesses and shortages. Many industries exhibiting shortages and rising prices, high rates of inflation, and many industries showing underutilized capacities because the output produced is not being utilized fully, is not being demanded fully, and therefore capacity is not being utilized. Now, how do we bridge these gaps between the income distribution as emerging and the targets of output and demand? You do that in various ways. First, you iterate. If there are excesses and shortages, then you iterate and you go over the same exercise again to bring the emerging income distribution more in line with the targeted output. You do that by iteration. Then you use monetary policy. If there is an overall excess of demand over supply, then you raise interest rates, you have credit squeezes, and you generally tighten the monetary situation and make it more difficult for people to obtain borrowed monies, and slow down number of projects that might be running which throw income into the market. Then you use fiscal policies. If there are shortages of one commodity in relation to demand, then you would like to augment production, and you do that by subsidizing the producers or by reducing the tax rates on producers, or you put a curb on demand if there is excess demand. You curb demand by taxing consumption. You put various purchase taxes and sales taxes and excises and custom duties and what have you in order to restrain demand for those commodities. If on the other hand there are surpluses of some commodities, then you can tax the producers and subsidize the consumers, thereby augmenting consumption a bit and reducing production a bit. There you attempt to bring supply and demands in line. But these are matters belonging to the realms of fiscal policy, monetary policy, physical control and rationing policies, and indeed iterations of the same mechanism again and again. This way, the planning machinery tries not only to augment output through the additional supplies of investment, particularly investment in infrastructural industries like railways and coal and steel and communications and fertilizers and irrigation systems, etc. You can do that. And simultaneously, you are controlling the demand according to the other theory we mentioned earlier. You are controlling the demand on the macroeconomic demand side. Through these policies of demand control and management on the one side and supply augmentation on the other, planning wants to achieve reasonable relation between aggregate demands and aggregate supplies, and thereby hopes to maintain the price level growing slowly, increasing slowly rather than rapidly. In India, through these mechanisms, we have managed to generate a 3.5% growth rate of the Indian economy for about 25 years, beginning 1951, and after 1975, we managed to augment the rate of growth of the output of the Indian economy, approaching 5%, but not quite. Hopes are in the Senate plan that the targeted 5% growth rate would be met, but there are many ifs and buts, and there's many a slip between the cup and the lip, and it remains to be seen how well the Indian economy will chase its output target and how well it will demand control the expenditures, so that demands and supplies are in line, and meanwhile the society gets augmented output. How to redistribute that output better, how to eliminate poverty, how to take from the large earning groups and give it to the small earning groups, how to bring about rural development, for instance, and poverty annihilation. Those are questions which would go beyond a mere planning model of this sort, and they would require policy frames which this country is trying to formulate all the time. Not that successes are made, but some success has been achieved in terms of better income distribution, at any rate lifting up the absolute level of income, if not annihilating relative poverty.